How did just 6,000 starving Scots crush 20,000 English knights who seemed invincible? A battle that changed Scotland's fate and humiliated England forever. The year was 1314, and the land of Scotland trembled under the weight of war. For nearly 2 decades, English kings had sought to bend the northern kingdom to their will. Castles fell, villages burned, and noble families were torn apart. Yet the fire of resistance burned fiercely in the heart of one man. Robert the Bruce, crowned King of Scots in 1306, though hunted like a fugitive for years thereafter. By June, his fate and Scotland's future were poised upon the edge of a blade. The English king, Edward II, had assembled a massive host, some 20,000 strong, heavy with mounted knights, armored infantry, and longbowmen. Their goal was simple: crush Bruce, relieve the besieged garrison at Stirling Castle, and erase forever the dream of Scottish independence. But Bruce, hardened by years of guerrilla warfare, knew he could never match the English in numbers or wealth. He commanded barely 6,000 men, farmers turned spearmen, clansmen loyal to the cause, and hardened warriors who had fought beside him since the dark days of exile. Yet these men carried something no coin could buy: a desperate will to fight for freedom. At the small village of Bannockburn, near Stirling, Bruce chose his ground with cunning precision. The terrain was narrow, hemmed in by marshland and the Bannockburn stream. To the untrained eye, it looked unsuitable for battle, but Bruce saw its genius. Here, the English cavalry, those fearsome mailed knights who had trampled armies from Wales to Flanders, would find their strength blunted, their horses bogged, their ranks choked. On the eve of battle, the Scottish campfires flickered in the twilight. Men sharpened spears, bound leather straps, and muttered prayers to saints long forgotten. Around them, the June air was thick with tension. Robert the Bruce walked among his men, not as a distant monarch, but as a commander who had bled with them. "Tomorrow," he told them, his voice steady, "the fate of Scotland hangs on our courage. We face an army 3 times our number. Yet God is not with the mighty host, but with the just cause. Hold the line, trust your brothers, and the soil of Bannockburn shall remember our stand for 1,000 years." A cheer rose, ragged but defiant. These were not trained legions nor mercenaries for hire. These were Scots, outnumbered, outarmed, yet unbroken. At dawn, the storm would break. The dawn of June 23, 1314, broke with a pale light creeping over the fields of Bannockburn. A heavy mist clung to the ground, muffling sound, veiling the land in an eerie calm before the storm. From the south, the rumble of hooves echoed like distant thunder. The English vanguard was advancing. At their head rode knights of great renown, steel-helmed and proud, banners whipping in the morning breeze. They expected the Scots to scatter at the mere sight of their glittering host. After all, what chance had a rabble of half-armored men against the might of England's finest horsemen? Yet Robert the Bruce knew his enemy well. He had ordered his army to form schiltrons, great circles and blocks of spearmen, with pikes leveled outward like a living wall of iron. On flat ground, the knights would have ridden them down. But here, hemmed by streams and boggy earth, the cavalry had little room to maneuver. The first test came swiftly. Sir Henry de Bohun, a young English knight, spotted Bruce himself riding ahead of the Scottish line. Bruce wore no grand armor, only a simple helm, and rode a small horse rather than a mighty war steed. To de Bohun, it seemed a gift from God, the chance to strike down the rebel king in a single blow. Lowering his lance, de Bohun spurred his charger forward, thundering across the field. Scottish hearts froze. If Bruce fell, the army might break before battle had truly begun. But Robert the Bruce did not retreat. Calm as the mist itself, he held his ground until the very last heartbeat. Then, with a sudden surge, he swerved aside, rose in his stirrups, and brought down his battle axe with all the fury of a nation's defiance. The weapon crashed through de Bohun's helm, splitting it, and the knight's skull, clean in two. The young Englishman tumbled lifeless to the ground, his horse bolting riderless across the field. For a heartbeat, silence gripped both armies. Then the Scots roared. Their king had struck down a charging knight with his own hand. The act was more than a victory. It was a symbol, a flame to ignite every heart. Yet Bruce himself, ever practical, looked only at his broken axe handle. "I've spoiled my good axe," he muttered, almost chiding himself. But in truth, he had given Scotland something far greater: unshakable faith. The first clash had ended not in English triumph, but in Scottish fire. And the storm was only beginning. The sun climbed higher, burning away the mist to reveal the full enormity of the English host. Across the fields, the banners of Edward II unfurled like a forest of color. Lions rampant, crosses of St. George, and heraldry of barons whose wealth dwarfed the entire Scottish treasury. Their knights gleamed in polished mail, their horses clad in armor, their ranks stretching beyond the horizon. From the Scottish lines, the sight was terrifying. 6,000 men stood against more than 3 times their number. Many of Bruce's soldiers were farmers, crofters, and shepherds, carrying pikes fashioned from ash trees, shields patched with leather. Against them loomed England's nobility, trained warriors, men who had fought on the fields of France and Flanders. Yet the Scottish king had chosen his ground wisely. The Bannockburn stream cut across the battlefield, its marshy banks treacherous for heavy cavalry. Dense woods pressed from one side, while narrow passages hemmed the other. Here, Edward's vast host could not spread its wings. They would be forced to funnel into the choke points where schiltrons waited. Still, the weight of numbers was daunting. The English archers, famed for their deadly longbows, could rain death from afar. Their knights, once unleashed, could smash through infantry like a hammer through glass. Among the Scottish ranks, murmurs spread. Some men gripped their spears until their knuckles whitened. Others whispered prayers, fearing this would be their last dawn on earth. Sensing doubt, the lords of Scotland rallied their men. James Douglas, fierce and tireless, reminded them of English cruelty. "Did they not burn your homes? Did they not chain your kin? Today, brothers, we answer." Thomas Randolph, Bruce's nephew, paced before his schiltron, his eyes burning. "Hold your ground, no matter the cost. Steel your arms, for freedom stands behind us." Then came a test of discipline. A detachment of English cavalry, perhaps 200 strong, swept around in an attempt to flank the Scots. Their lances glittered as they galloped, expecting to crush a handful of men. Randolph's schiltron wheeled into position, pikes lowering as one. The knights struck like a wave upon a cliff, but the Scottish wall held. Horses screamed as iron met wood, lances shattered, riders toppled. Again and again the cavalry pressed, but each charge splintered upon the hedge of spears. At last, broken and bleeding, the English fell back, leaving the ground littered with bodies. The Scots erupted in cheers. They had withstood the first true assault of England's might and lived. Confidence swelled like fire in dry grass. Perhaps, just perhaps, victory was not a dream. But across the field, Edward II looked on, his pride stung. Tomorrow, he vowed, he would unleash his full fury and grind these rebels into the earth. As the sun dipped behind the western hills on June 23rd, the battlefield grew eerily quiet. The moans of the wounded drifted across the fields, mingling with the croak of frogs in the Bannockburn. Both armies withdrew to their camps, each side knowing that the morrow would bring either glory or ruin. In the Scottish camp, the men gathered around their fires, their faces glowing in the flickering light. Some sharpened their spears, others whispered prayers, and many simply stared into the flames, lost in thought. They knew the truth. Few expected them to survive. Yet the victory over Randolph's schiltron had planted a seed of hope. If pikes could withstand the English charge once, perhaps they could again. Robert the Bruce moved quietly among his men. He did not sit apart like Edward in his lavish pavilion, surrounded by silken banners and foreign advisors. Instead, Bruce clasped shoulders, shared bread, and spoke plainly to those who trembled. "Brothers," he told them, "tomorrow we stand not only for Scotland, but for every hearth, every child, every acre of soil that the English would claim as their own. Should we fall, our land is lost. But if we endure, Scotland breathes free. James Douglas added his voice, fierce as ever. I would rather die 10 times than live once as Edward's hound. Laughter followed his words, rough but genuine. The Scots understood they were not fighting for conquest or riches, but for the right to be free men in their own land. Meanwhile, across the stream, the English camp sprawled like a small city. Tens of thousands feasted on provisions carried from the south. Laughter and arrogance filled the air. Many knights, recalling the ease with which they had crushed Welsh and French peasants, boasted that tomorrow's fight would be but a hunt. We'll ride them down like deer, some declared. Yet not all were so confident. A few seasoned veterans warned of the dangerous ground, the narrow choke points, the stubborn resistance already shown. But Edward II, young and proud, dismissed their caution. He dreamed of a triumph to rival his father's conquests, of returning to London with Bruce's crown as a trophy. As darkness deepened, the stars glittered cold above Bannockburn. The Scots lay upon the grass, many without tents, clutching their weapons even as they drifted into uneasy sleep. Across the fields, the English knights reclined in silken pavilions, oblivious to the peril of the ground beneath them. The night stretched long, heavy with silence. The air itself seemed to wait, and when dawn broke, it would break upon one of the most fateful days in Scotland's history. June 24th dawned bright and merciless. The sun rose over the Stirling Hills, its light glinting on thousands of helms and spearheads. The mist had burned away, leaving the battlefield stark and clear. There would be no hiding now, no retreat. From the Scottish lines, a murmur of awe spread as the sheer scale of the English army revealed itself. Rows upon rows of mounted knights stretched into the distance, their banners snapping proudly in the breeze. Behind them stood archers and footmen in numbers that dwarfed the entire Scottish host. It was like staring into a tide about to crash. But Bruce had prepared. He had drawn his army into schiltrons, dense hedges of spears bristling in every direction, each block commanded by trusted captains. Randolph, Douglas, and Edward Bruce, the king's brother. The men knelt upon the earth, raised their hands, and prayed aloud, God and St. Andrew be with us. Across the field, Edward II gave the order to advance. The ground trembled as English knights spurred their massive destriers forward, lances lowering, shields locking. The thunder of hooves rolled like a storm across the plain. To the English, this was the moment they lived for, the charge, the glory, the crushing of lesser men beneath iron and horseflesh. The Scots stood firm. As the charge bore down upon them, the schiltrons locked tight, spear points gleaming in the sun. When the first wave of cavalry struck, the sound was like trees splintering in a gale. Horses reared, impaled upon pikes. Riders were hurled from saddles, their armor clanging as they hit the ground. The momentum of the charge died upon the wall of spears. Again and again the knights charged, desperate to break through. Each time, the Scots pressed their spears deeper into the earth, bracing with all their strength. The battlefield became a writhing mass of men and beasts, screams mingling with the clash of steel. Blood ran into the marshes, turning the ground slick and treacherous. Then, from the Scottish rear, Bruce unleashed his small cavalry force. Barely 500 horsemen, they swept around the flanks, harassing the English archers before they could bring their longbows to bear. Deprived of their deadliest weapon, the English struggled to regroup. As the sun climbed higher, the tide began to turn. For every fallen Scot, 3 English knights lay dead or pinned beneath their horses. What had begun as a confident assault was turning into a grinding, bloody stalemate. Edward II watched from his command post, his pride wavering. This was no easy victory. The rebels were not breaking. They were holding, bleeding his army upon the spears of Bannockburn. And worse, the Scots had only begun to fight. By midday, the field at Bannockburn had become a nightmare of mud, steel, and blood. The once proud charge of the English knights had dissolved into chaos. Horses, pierced by spears, flailed and crashed into one another, throwing armored riders into the muck. The narrow ground, chosen so carefully by Robert the Bruce, had turned the might of England into a trap of its own making. The Chilterns held fast, their spears a wall of death. Time and again, English nobles hurled themselves forward, only to be swallowed by the hedge of ash pikes. The Scots fought with grim determination, their cries carrying over the din, "Freedom for Scotland!" In the midst of the carnage, James Douglas led sorties against stragglers, darting in and out like a wolf among sheep. Thomas Randolph's Chiltern, bloodied but unbroken, stood its ground against wave after wave, and Robert the Bruce himself, calm and resolute, rode along the lines, his presence a steady flame in the storm. But the English king had yet another card to play. Edward II ordered his archers forward, hoping their deadly arrows would tear apart the Chilterns from a distance. The longbow had brought England victory before. It had humbled knights in France and crushed Welsh rebels. Now it might break the Scots, yet Bruce had foreseen this. His small but nimble cavalry, commanded by Sir Robert Keith, swept around the English flanks like a hawk striking its prey. With ruthless precision, they scattered the longbowmen before they could unleash their volleys. Panic spread among the archers, who fled into the chaos of their own lines, adding to the disorder. The field grew more cramped, more suffocating. English knights, trapped between marshland and the unyielding wall of spears, found themselves pressed so tightly they could scarcely lift their swords. The weight of their own numbers became their undoing. Horses stumbled over the fallen, men drowned in the marshes, and the cries of the dying drowned out commands. From the Scottish ranks rose a chant, deep and thunderous. "Lay on them! Press them! Scotland! Scotland!" The sound rolled across the battlefield like thunder, shaking even the most hardened English knights. For the first time, cracks appeared in Edward's host. Men began to falter, their confidence shaken. The invincible tide of England was grinding itself to pieces against a wall of iron and courage. The tide had begun to turn, and Scotland was pushing forward. The afternoon sun blazed hot upon Bannockburn, glinting off blood-slick armor and shattered spears. The English knights, once proud and disciplined, were now a mob pressed too tightly upon cursed ground. Horses screamed, men cursed, and the clang of steel upon steel was drowned by the roar of Scottish voices. The Chilterns no longer stood passively, they advanced. Step by step, shoulder to shoulder, the Scots pushed forward, their spears bristling like the quills of some monstrous beast. Each pace drove the English further into the mire, compressing them into a suffocating mass. For the knights, retreat was impossible. Behind them pressed their own ranks, still trying to charge. Before them loomed a wall of spears. Robert the Bruce, his axe swinging, called out above the din, "Press them, my brothers! One more step for Scotland!" His men roared in answer and surged ahead. The English began to break. Some knights dismounted, hoping to fight on foot, but were dragged down into the muck. Others tried to wheel their horses, only to find themselves trapped by their own comrades. Panic, like a poison, spread through the host, and then, as if the gods themselves willed it, a new force appeared upon the horizon. Thousands of Scottish camp followers, cooks, grooms, and servants, crested the hill waving banners and makeshift weapons. To the weary English, it seemed as though fresh Scottish reinforcements had arrived. A cry of terror rippled through their ranks. "Another army! We are undone!" That was the breaking point. The English line collapsed. Knights spurred their horses in desperate flight, trampling their own men in their haste to escape. Foot soldiers threw down their arms and scattered into the marshes, where many were cut down. The once proud banners of England dipped into the mud. Edward II himself, surrounded by his household guard, realized the battle was lost. His advisors urged him to flee. Reluctant, shaken, the king turned his horse and galloped from the field, abandoning his army to ruin. The rout was complete. The field of Bannockburn was now a graveyard of English pride. The mighty host, 20,000 strong, was broken by 6,000 Scots who had stood their ground. And amid the carnage, The cry rose higher than ever. Scotland! Scotland forever! Edward II fled Bannockburn in disgrace. Once surrounded by a sea of banners and armored knights, the King of England now rode with only a handful of terrified companions. Mud splattered his cloak. His gilded armor weighed heavy upon him, and the cries of the dying echoed behind like a curse. Through the narrow paths north of the battlefield he galloped, pursued by Scottish horsemen eager to claim the richest prize of all, the capture of the English king. James Douglas himself led the chase, his small cavalry cutting down stragglers as they closed upon the fleeing monarch. "Ride him down!" Douglas roared, his voice fierce above the thunder of hooves. "Let no crown escape Bannockburn." Yet Edward was lucky. His guards, though few, were desperate and loyal. They formed around him, their swords flashing as they fended off the pursuers. Several fell beneath Scottish blades, buying precious moments for their sovereign. At last, Edward's horse, lathered and staggering, carried him into the safety of Dunbar Castle, held by a loyal ally. From there, he boarded a ship and sailed ignominiously back to England. His dream of crushing Bruce and cementing his legacy lay in ruins. On the field, the slaughter was merciless. With no quarter given, thousands of English knights and footmen perished in the mire, their bodies piled high where they had stood. Others, stripped of armor and pride, surrendered in droves. The roads southward clogged with fugitives, harried at every step by vengeful Scots. Robert the Bruce stood amidst the wreckage, his face grim but resolute. Victory was his, yet he did not revel in the bloodshed. He had won not merely a battle but the survival of a nation. His men gathered around him, weary yet exultant, raising their spears to the sky. "My brothers," Bruce declared, his voice carrying over the field, "this day Scotland is free. You have broken the chains of tyranny and proved that no host, no king, no empire can master men who fight for their own soil." A great cry rose, echoing across Bannockburn, mingling with the wind. Freedom! The flight of Edward marked not only a king's humiliation but the beginning of Scotland's triumph. The English dragon was wounded, and Bruce's star blazed higher than ever. When the clash of steel finally ceased, the battlefield lay silent save for the groans of the wounded and the cawing of circling crows. Bannockburn was no longer a meadow but a graveyard, its soil churned into black mud by thousands of trampling hooves and soaked in English blood. Broken lances jutted from the earth like skeletal trees, banners lay trampled in the mire, and the once proud corpses of England's nobility sprawled lifeless in heaps. The Scots moved among the wreckage, some seeking fallen comrades, others stripping the dead of armor and weapons. For men who had fought with little more than patched shields and crude spears, the spoils of Bannockburn were a fortune. Helms, swords, destriers, treasures beyond reckoning, fell into Scottish hands. Yet amid the victory, solemnity reigned. Robert the Bruce ordered prayers for the dead, both Scot and English, for though enemies in life, they were all men now returned to the earth. Chaplains intoned Latin hymns, their voices carrying over the hushed field, while warriors knelt, bloodied and weary, in reverence. The scale of the triumph was staggering. Of Edward's mighty host, thousands lay dead, among them earls, barons, and knights of high renown. Many more had been captured, destined for ransom that would enrich Scotland's coffers for years to come. The English army, pride of the realm thought invincible, was shattered. Around Bruce gathered his captains, James Douglas, fierce-eyed and unbowed, Thomas Randolph, his armor dented and bloody yet his spirit unbroken, and Edward Bruce, the king's brother, still flushed with the glory of victory. Each bore the marks of battle, yet their faces shone with pride. "Never has Scotland seen such a day," Randolph murmured. "Aye," Douglas growled, his voice still fierce, "and may England never forget it." Robert the Bruce lifted his gaze to the horizon, where the sun now dipped low, casting the land in golden light. For the first time in many years, he allowed himself a breath of peace. The war was not ended. Edward would return, and more battles lay ahead, but the tide had turned. Scotland had shown that courage and cunning could overcome even the mightiest foe. Bannockburn would live forever in song and story, not as a mere battle, but as a symbol. A symbol of freedom wrested from the jaws of tyranny. And as the Scots raised their voices in one final cheer, the hills themselves seemed to echo, "Scotland forever!" In the days that followed, the news of Bannockburn swept across Britain like wildfire. To the Scots, it was a miracle. Villagers who had lived in fear of English raids now celebrated openly, their church bells ringing, their banners unfurled. Ballads sprang from the lips of bards, praising Bruce and the bravery of his men. The story of how 6,000 Scots humbled 20,000 English would be sung at hearthfires for generations. To England, the defeat was a humiliation beyond imagining. Edward II, already scorned by many of his nobles, returned in disgrace. Whispers grew louder in his court. Was he fit to rule? His father, Edward I, had been the hammer of the Scots, feared across Europe. The sun had been broken on Scottish soil. Bannockburn was not merely a loss of soldiers. It was the shattering of England's pride. For Robert the Bruce, the victory was more than survival, it was vindication. Once hunted like a criminal, forced into exile, his very crown mocked as illegitimate, he now stood unchallenged as King of Scots. Bannockburn secured his throne, and in time, it would pave the way for the Treaty of Edinburgh-Northampton in 1328, when England at last recognized Scotland's independence. Yet the battle's true legacy lay not in treaties or crowns, but in spirit. Bannockburn proved that freedom could not be bought nor crushed beneath armored hooves. It showed that a smaller people, united by will and led with cunning, could defy even the greatest empire. It became more than a military triumph. It became the heartbeat of a nation. In later centuries, when Scotland faced hardship, betrayal, or union, the memory of Bannockburn returned like a flame. On June mornings, Scots would remember the farmers turned warriors, the Chilterns bristling against impossible odds, and the moment when Robert the Bruce split Henry de Bohun's helm in two, igniting hope in every heart. The fields of Bannockburn, once soaked in blood, grew green again. But beneath the grass lay the bones of those who had fought, silent witnesses to a day when destiny turned. And above them, the wind carried a whisper that would never die. Here Scotland stood free,